So here we go. As if you've been following this channel, you know that Andrew and I have been saying that this was going to happen to Rojava the whole time. Rojava is the territory in Syria north of the Euphrates River. Kind of goes diagonally across the country, and that section on above where Raqqa is, that would be the biggest city on that side of the river, is called Rojava. And the Kurds call it Kurdistan. They basically annex territory under the pretext of fighting ISIS, the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria, because you have to have a pretext. You can't just arm a bunch of Kurds and give them land. That wouldn't make sense to the world community. So the excuse is the left hand arms ISIS and a bunch of other Al-Qaeda groups, and then the right hand responds by arming the Kurds to kind of WWE style play fight with them, although they really just divide up territory in Syria. The Syrian army is who's actually fighting ISIS, but the Syrian army could not fight with the Kurds because the Kurds were protected by the American Air Force. Therefore, the Kurds were all offense. They could expand their territory more and more, and you could never take it back from them, because if you step foot on their side, the American Air Force would blow you up. And that was tested, and that is exactly what happened. Okay, so what is annexation? All right, it's stealing land and sitting on it, basically. So like, if you steal something and control it for long enough, it gets harder and harder to give it back. Andrew and I said, for a bunch of different reasons, of things that happened during the war, Turkey taking Afrin, Iraq pushing Kurds out, of Iraq, which is important because the pipelines that go across from Iraq to Syria were cut off, that this Rojava experiment was kind of dead in the water as far as oil transportation. Plan B, though, is still to balkanize Syria. What does balkanize mean? Balkanization is referring to an event that happened in the 90s in an area called the Balkans, made up of 7 or 8, if you include Kosovo, different nations, where Yugoslavia was divided into a bunch of smaller nation states that were kind of based around religious and ethnic fervor, and then all these factions were fighting with each other. So when I say they balkanized, that's what that means. Balkanized in Syria means they're trying to get Kurds and Sunni and Shia and Druze and Christians and all these different groups to fight with each other, which is something that happened in Lebanon, which is something that the Israelis actually wrote about as a desired goal for Syria. The more these Arabs fight with each other, the better it is for Israel. They want to weaken the state of Syria. They want these ethnic groups fighting with each other and engaged in tribal nepotism, because it's a failed strategy. So even if they couldn't transport the resources out of Syria, they get 2 other things. One is the balkanization that keeps Syria weak. The second thing is Israel can use that Kurdish territory as a base of operations for their air force to attack other regions in Syria as well as Iraq, which is something that they have done. So Israel still wants to keep this Kurdish region. Now, there is a country north of Syria that has had a historic problem with the Kurds, and I'm not going to explain that whole history, just they have been fighting with each other in Turkey. There's a group called the PKK that they're fighting with, Kurdish Workers' Party. They are communist. There's the YPG inside northern Syria, Rojava, as I just explained. They are sometimes called the SDF, but it's really the YPG, which is the Kurdish group that's supposed to be fighting ISIS, but actually they're just taking territory for themselves from the people of Syria. They killed Assyrians. Assyrians are a group that lives in Syria. It's an ancient group that used to be called Assyria back in the day with the Hittites, and maybe you know your ancient history. The Assyrians are largely Christian and were getting murdered by Kurds. and Kurds took private property and infrastructure, including oil, away from the prior owners and awarded it to themselves. This was done by force. So people in the media saying Syria's Kurdish ally, that's BS. Syria put up with it because they were nearly annihilated by these Al-Qaeda groups in western Syria. They had to deal with that first. And then they couldn't do anything about the Kurds taking territory since the Kurds were protected by the United States, and the United States is the most powerful player, and not just militarily, it's their economic threats and other leverages that they have that make them able to hold on to whatever they feel like. But it does cost America billions of dollars, and it's not in their interest at all. They gain nothing from this. Syria, Russia, Hezbollah, and Iran is who defeated ISIS. Okay, and Iraqi militia groups, Shia groups, which I would include that as part of Iran's sphere of influence, also helped fight ISIS. ISIS is not the only Al-Qaeda group, but I'm not going to get into too many details again. Turkey did not want a large Kurdish group on their southern border that would be able to pop in and out of Turkey and support the PKK and support Kurdish terrorism on Turkey. Now, Kurdish terrorism on Turkey is not out of the blue. Turkey is also guilty of fighting with the Kurds. I'm not talking about who's right or wrong. I'm not talking about what ought to be. I'm talking about what is and what's going to happen. And the leverage and pressure from Turkey, a NATO member, the strongest member after the United States, especially, within their neighborhood. The further you extend, the weaker you get, right? So Turkey's is stronger than the UK if you're talking about facing a country adjacent to Turkey, right? They have more leverage than a landlocked Kurdish state. Kurds weren't always ever just supported because it benefited Israel, okay? So now I'm going to show you the extreme left and the extreme right in full agreement on this issue. Not to make it complicated, but let's go through a little history here. Alright, I'm just going to show you 4 more pictures to make it real simple. By the way, if you'd like to donate, here is the link. It's in the description. I cannot read the chat while I'm rattling on, I'm sorry. So, let's look at some headlines. Israel said to import $1 billion in oil from Iraqi Kurds. Alright, this is what they did to Iraq. They balkanized Iraq, that means divided it up along sectarian lines. Kurds around the north, Sunni around Mosul in the southwest, and then Shia around the capital in Baghdad. The oil rich area where the Kurds were was sent to Haifa, okay, in Israel. $1 billion worth. Times of Israel. This is their own newspaper. Alright, let's continue. Report. Israel imports 77% of its oil from Iraqi Kurdistan. This is from the Financial Times. Israel's reportedly bought 19 million barrels of Kurdish oil in recent months, says Financial Times. Alright, 77% of its oil. Let's continue. Jerusalem Post, another Israeli, very pro-Zionist newspaper. Israel importing 77% of its oil supply from Iraqi Kurdistan. Financial Times, they quote too. Alright, so you see what's going on there. 3/4 of Israel's oil, not America, it was coming from the stolen territory in Iraq where they placed the Kurds, and they are even calling it Kurdistan. Now, they lost that. The plan for Syria was very much the same. And not so much about Israel getting oil. Syria doesn't have a lot of oil. But by taking the oil away from Syria hurts them dramatically. And then Israel's a small enough state that they'll take that oil is significant enough for them. So, Lindsey Graham, who I just quoted before, saying we can't withdraw from Syria, the guy that co-authored the bill in the Senate to put sanctions on Turkey for fighting the Kurds, finally just stops hiding it. Here we go. Senator Lindsey Graham calls troop withdrawal from northern Syria a nightmare for Israel. Senator Graham of South Carolina said President Donald Trump's decision to withdraw U.S. troops from northern Syria will eventually become a nightmare for Israel. There you go. They're finally showing their hand. The entire process of supporting Kurds in Syria was never about Kurdish autonomy. The same with Iraq. It wasn't, oh, our poor Kurds, our poor Yazidi, our poor pick an ethnic group that Americans didn't know about until after the war started. It was always about creating an annexed territory for a religious group that would be loyal to the Zog. And they were. But with Turkey taking Afrin, which cuts off access to the sea, and Iraq pushing them out on the other side, they were left with a landlocked state. Now, Israel still wants this, oil or not, because they can use it as a base of operations to do airstrikes on the surrounding territories. Now, we've been over this, and we've been over their plan. They still haven't even given up on the oil. They wanted to send it through black markets to Turkey, which could get to the Mediterranean and reach Israel. Okay? Part of taking the Stolen Heights was to try to get a path through there. That doesn't work because the surrounding, let me make it more easy. The territory around the Golan Heights is completely controlled by the Syrian army, so nothing's going that way either. And obviously they're not going to send it through Lebanon with Hezbollah there, so they can't go that way. The only way was to go through the Mediterranean. Latakia, the western part of Syria that hits the Med, is and has always been under Syrian control because Russia has a base there is one of the main reasons, okay, which is in Russia's interest. Russia is not helping Syria because they're good or altruistic. They're doing it because it's in their own interest, all right? If it wasn't, the moment it isn't, Russia's going to do things for itself. All these players are. Iran, too, sees this as in their own interest because they're next. They need to stop it in Syria, all right? Saudi Arabia possibly just water mined or missiled, I think more likely mines, we'll see, an Iranian oil tanker which spilled oil into the Red Sea. And that oil was headed toward Syria, all right? Gonna have to go through the Suez to do that. So, our support for the Kurds that you're seeing on the left and on the right, all the talking heads on CNN and on MSNBC, on Fox even, with the exception of Tucker maybe, on CBS, on ABC, on the comedy shows, which are still political shows, it's all part of the program, is we are abandoning our poor Kurdish allies who've been fighting ISIS as an ally of Syria. That is not true. Kurds were fighting for themselves to take territory away from Syria, to create a state for themselves. Their end goal was a federation where they would have their own government, their own everything, and just effectively steal half of Syria. All right? That could still happen. But they're not going to be sitting on the northern border next to Turkey, because Turkey, took them about a day and a half, has already cleared that zone, and they'll be going further south. So now the question will be, is Turkey going to leave after they take this territory? Are the Kurds going to try and cut a deal with Syria or Russia or any party that'll take a deal to try and federalize within Syria and try to maintain some sort of Kurdish autonomy? They're ethnostaters, is what they are. And they engage in ethnic nepotism, and they engage in ethnic cleansing. They have also been the victims of ethnic cleansing. That does not give one the right to do it to someone else. Kurds could live in Syria as Syrian citizens the same way Italians or Germans or whatever can live in America as Americans. But you do it as Americans.